A psychologist needs to have a good understanding of the unconscious mind because so much of what we do, think, feel, and perceive is beyond the scope of the conscious mind. Sigmund Freud became famous for conceptualizing the unconscious in a way that, at the time, was considered rather controversial. Jung, being one of Freud's students, realized the importance and utility of Freud's way of thinking about the unconscious, but also realized that it was one-sided and incomplete. In this video, we'll discuss how Jung expanded Freud's view of the unconscious to give us a more complete picture of the human mind. I'm probably gonna get demonetized for this one. It sucks because I'm just trying to educate people, but whatever, let's move on. If you think that I don't deserve to be demonetized, please smash that like button. I hate sounding like a YouTuber, but yeah, if you could like the video, that would probably help increase the engagement. So Freud thought of the unconscious as that aspect of human psychology which was directly polar to the civilized state of humanity, where morals and cultural rules prevent us from acting out our animal impulses. These animal impulses more or less constitute the unconscious mind. So really the unconscious is just where all of that raw, untamed animality goes as a result of being suppressed by the pressures of civilization. As Jung writes about this, according to the views of this school, man, as a civilized being, is unable to act out a large number of instinctive impulses and wishes, for the simple reason that they are incompatible with law and morality. Insofar, therefore, as he wants to adapt himself to society, he is obliged to suppress these wishes. So when we have wishes that are incompatible with the way we've structured society, we suppress them and they become unconscious. But this suppression doesn't eliminate the wish. It just pushes it into the unconscious where it begins to act unconsciously. And the wish will begin to secretly influence our psyche and direct us towards fulfillment of the wish. And chief amongst these instinctive impulses is sexuality. This makes sense to a certain extent because sex is paramount for the survival of the species. So naturally, a significant proportion of our psychological energy will be dedicated towards sex. This is really obvious, and I think almost every person who's watching this will realize how much sex tends to occupy their minds. To make this point even more convincing, just think about every person you know, and also every person you don't know, and realize that they exist because someone decided to have sex. Usually two people, occasionally more. But sexuality is an instinct that doesn't have free reign, especially in the modern world. As Jung explains, sexuality is an important physical and widely ramified psychic function on which the whole future of humanity depends. It is thus at least as important as the function of nutrition, even though it is an instinct of another kind. But whereas we can allow the nutritive function, from the devouring of a simple piece of bread to a guild banquet, to be seen by all eyes in all its variations, and at most must hold it checked because of an attack of intestinal catarrh or a general food shortage, sexuality comes under a moral taboo, and has to submit to a large number of legal regulations and restrictions. The Freudian theory treats sex as the most fundamental instinct in the human psyche, and therefore treats most cases of neurosis as resulting from repressed sexuality. In fact, Freud believed that the discontent of civilization stemmed largely from the fact that we all want to have sex without restraint, but society is always telling us no. And in fact, this extra buildup of libido caused by the repression of sexuality is used to fuel society. It's what makes us work hard at our jobs and earn money, usually with the expectation that we'll receive sex as a reward. Jung writes that the whole Freudian movement has settled firmly for the sexual theory. There is certainly no unprejudiced thinker or investigator who would not instantly acknowledge the extraordinary importance of sexual or erotic experiences and conflicts, but it will never be proved that sexuality is the fundamental instinct and the activating principle of the human psyche. Any unprejudiced scientist will, on the contrary, admit that the psyche is an extremely complex structure. So according to Freud, or more accurately according to Jung's interpretation of Freud, sex is the principal drive in the human psyche, and neurosis arises when we repress our sexual impulses into the unconscious. Again, this repression doesn't eliminate those sexual desires, it just pushes them into the unconscious, where they begin to influence us from there. And the unconscious will just guide us towards fulfillment of those wishes. Now, Jung's basic premise is that this is actually accurate. You see, I often encounter people who, when studying depth psychology, think that Freud was an idiot and his theories were wrong, whereas in contrast, Jung's theories were right. But Jung himself thought that Freud was actually right about this. Sexuality does play a significant role in human psychology, and repressed sexuality can lead to neurotic symptoms. People often forget that, by and large, Jung was a Freudian. But Jung didn't believe that Freud's ideas fully encapsulated the nature of the unconscious. It only captured one aspect of it, albeit a fairly crucial aspect. This means that there's much more to the unconscious than simply sexuality. And it seems that Freud, by overemphasizing the importance of sexuality, made it clear that he was really just kind of describing himself, which is awkward to say the least. So from Jung's perspective, Freud's ideas were true, they just weren't the whole truth. One example of the fact that Freud often overemphasized sexuality is the fact that Jung argued that when Freud speaks about sexuality, oftentimes what he actually means is closer to the concept of love or eros. As he writes, "Distasteful as such a view is, that view being Freud's attribution of sexuality to everything, we must give it its due if we want to discover all the things that Freud has smuggled into the concept of sexuality. We shall then see that he has widened its boundaries far beyond the permitted limits, so that a better word for what he actually means would be eros, in the old philosophical sense of a pan-eros, who permeates all nature as a creative and procreative force." And so Jung argues that Freud is actually very often referring to love, but then more or less assumes that love is just a sexual emotion. Which I think isn't the case. Like, they often go together, but not necessarily. Like, it's possible to have love without sex and sex without love. So Freud's view of reducing all psychic processes to sexuality oversimplifies the psyche. Yes, the sexual instinct is very important, and a large proportion of our psychological problems may be due to sexual dysfunction or repressed sexuality. But it would be wrong to assert that this is so in every case of neurosis. Jung's conception of the unconscious expands Freud's view. And he posits an energic view of the psyche, meaning that the unconscious consists of a wide range of contents which only differ by the amount of energy our minds happen to be affording that content. And this energy determines what will become conscious or not. So for example, if you're feeling particularly horny, a significant proportion of your energy is going towards sex, and so your mind will be focused on that. If you're feeling hungry, that will enter the forefront of your mind and your energy will be devoted towards finding something to eat. Anything that doesn't have a sufficient energy will remain unconscious. Jung and Freud's contrasting views of the unconscious also give us contrasting interpretations of the meaning of dreams. For Freud, dreams are wish fulfillments. Our dreams are a place for our repressed desires to find some form of expression. Jung took a different approach, viewing dreams to be symbolic images from the unconscious, i.e. the unconscious trying to show us something that we otherwise are not able to grasp consciously. And personally, I think that both of these theories can be true to an extent, and they don't necessarily contradict each other. So the complete structure of the unconscious in a Jungian model is something that I'll probably have to describe in a later video because it's quite complex. I have made a bunch of videos that discuss it in some detail, so I'll probably link those somewhere either in the description or up here, wherever it is. And you can check that out and learn more about Jung's view of the unconscious. But here are some important points. We already mentioned the fact that anything we repress will end up in the unconscious, not just sexual impulses, but also for traumas and anything that we don't want to think about will end up in the unconscious. But it also consists of everything that we happen to forget. We have already taken cognizance of repressions as contents of the unconscious, and to these we must add everything that we have forgotten. When a thing is forgotten, it does not mean that it is extinguished. It simply means that the memory has become subliminal. Its energy charge has sunk so low that it can no longer appear in consciousness. But, though lost to consciousness, it is not lost to the unconscious. Jung also adds to his conception of the unconscious everything that's in the field of perception that we aren't paying direct attention to. These are also unconscious contents. So right now you're experiencing all sorts of sensations coming through your sense organs, but you're probably only giving a few of these any of your attention. For example, the video itself and maybe my voice. Whereas the way that the floor feels touching your feet is something that you're unconscious of. Until I just mentioned it, now you're conscious of it. And also the way your tongue feels in your mouth. Me mentioning these things causes your consciousness to turn towards them, but before that they were in the unconscious. As Jung writes about this, besides things that have been forgotten, subliminal perceptions form part of the contents of the unconscious. These may be sense perceptions occurring below the stimulus threshold of conscious hearing, or in the peripheral field of vision. Or they may be apperceptions, by which are meant perceptions of endopsychic or external processes. Now, all of this material constitutes the personal unconscious, which is called so because it's confined to an individual's experience, either of their immediate environment or of events that have occurred in the past. But Jung then explains that the personal unconscious can't be the whole of the unconscious. And one proof he has for this is the fact that people will have dreams and fantasies that have no connection to their personal lives. He noticed that these contents often have a mythological character, and that people who have no connection to each other will often experience the same types of mythological fantasies being produced by their unconscious minds. As he writes, where do these mythological fantasies come from? If they do not spring from the personal unconscious, and hence from the experiences of personal life, indubitably they come from the brain. Indeed, precisely from the brain, and not from personal memory traces, but from the inherited brain structure itself. Such fantasies always have a highly original and creative character. They are like new creations. Obviously, they derive from the creative activity of the brain, and not simply from its mnemonic activity. We receive along with our body a highly differentiated brain, which brings with it its entire history, and when it becomes creative, it creates out of this history, out of the history of mankind. By history, we usually mean the history which we make, and we call this objective history. The truly creative fantasy activity of the brain has nothing to do with this kind of history, but solely with that age-old natural history which has been transmitted in living form since the remotest times, namely, the history of the brain structure. And this structure tells its own story, which is the story of mankind, the unending myth of death and rebirth, and of the multitudinous figures who weave in and out of this mystery. Jung is suggesting, and I suspect that many of you already knew this, that the instincts themselves, or as he calls them, the archetypes, form a significant proportion of our unconscious minds. And they form the architecture of the mind, which exists before there's any input from the external world. Sexuality is included in this. But one thing that Jung noticed about the unconscious and the archetypes is that they act very autonomously. Very often, it's like they possess their own intelligence, which is often superior to that of the conscious mind in many respects. If you treat the unconscious as merely a receptacle for repressed wishes, this intelligent aspect of the unconscious is largely ignored. The unconscious is a living presence. It is way older than the unconscious mind, and is in fact the true master of the psyche. Now, there's also a compensatory function of the unconscious which Jung speaks about, and a symbol-producing function of the unconscious. And both of these are rather complicated, so I'm going to save them for a future video. And I've also made a lot of videos discussing the archetypes, so if you want to get a more in-depth understanding of that concept, I'll put a playlist in the cards which you can check out. But yeah, anyways, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, a great way to ask would be to join us on Discord, which you can do through our Patreon page. But anyways, have a good day, and may good luck always come your way.